Welcome to the Professional Investment Podcast. I'm Charlotte Moore, award-winning journalist and co-founder of Moore Squared Communications. Each episode, we welcome a guest to the show to share their news story of the week. And I'm delighted to welcome Laasya Shekaran, Director at Pensions for Purpose, to the show this week. Welcome, Laasya.
Thank you so much for having me, Charlotte.
Lovely to have you on the show. Do tell us, what is your news story of the week?
Yeah, so my news story of the week, it isn't the most fun story. It's about more and more companies rolling back their diversity initiatives, particularly in the US and particularly on the back of the kind of DEI backlash that we've seen coming from some of Trump's announcements recently.
Yeah, it's quite a story because it's kind of like a rolling live blog, doesn't it? And it catalogs all of the companies in the US that are rolling back their D&I initiatives. So why is this of interest to professional investors?
Yeah, I mean, I think this topic of diversity, equity and inclusion is something that's been on investors' radars for a while. I think the conversation has focused a lot on what DEI means for financial performance. You know, is DEI linked with better performance? Is it linked with better decision making? That's something that lots of firms have been thinking about. They've also been looking at their own stuff. You know, financial services is an industry made of people. You know, the investment industry is full of people. We shouldn't forget that, you know, people are at the heart of everybody that works in it, but also who we serve, the reason that we're investing in the first place. So really understanding the diversity of the people who are involved with the investment industry is important, and making sure that everyone's included. But there are also kind of wider social justice movements that fit into this as well, like the socially responsible investment movement. A lot of that came around kind of dealing with injustices that are related to race, and particularly with the transatlantic slave trade. And, you know, there are other ways that the financial system has a lot of influence on these kind of social issues. But also we're very much affected by what goes on in the world, and, you know, what's happening across the pond, what's happening politically. That affects us as well. That affects the way we think about things. But I think as professional investors, it's really important for us to kind of cut through the noise a bit and keep a long-term focus. Really go back to, you know, why do we care about diversity? Why are we talking about this in the first place? And then do what we think is right, rather than just being swayed by what's going on politically elsewhere.
I mean, there's certainly been a very rapid change since Trump was elected president and was sworn into office. And we've seen like rafts of anti-ESG and anti-D&I announcements. And I wonder, you know, how much this is noise and how much this is fundamental change. And obviously, we're seeing a bifurcation between the US and Europe as well, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I think that these things don't happen in a vacuum. In some ways, it feels quite sudden, but clearly there's been a lot of unease building up for a while. And I think some of that's justified, and we do need to listen to where people are coming from. You know, a lot of the time, we're living in a situation in kind of the world right now where many people are suffering and they're having a hard time. Cost of living is hard. Finding a job is hard. You know, there are lots of hardships that people face. And unfortunately, when that happens, hate becomes a very powerful weapon. And you know, topics like diversity, equity and inclusion that kind of have nothing to do with a lot of the issues that many people face are kind of being positioned as the source of the problem, and as a result there's a lot of backlash. So I think we really need to understand like where the backlash is coming from, why people have felt left behind by these movements, whether it's ESG or DEI, and look to come together to address that. Because when DEI initiatives are successful, they make things better for everyone, not just for certain groups of people.
Yeah, I mean, there, you know, before this, we were hearing lots of news about how DEI made sense, not just from the social justice perspective, but also from a rational investor perspective, that a company with an inclusive board that had better female representation, better ethnic representation, would actually perform better over the long run. And along with this kind of anti-ESG, anti-DEI backlash, there also seems to be some questioning of that. And whether there really is that relationship, that long-term relationship between positive performance and DEI performance. What do you think's going on there?
So I think there's some very well justified skepticism around that, and there's been quite a lot of academics that have looked at some of the studies that have linked demographic diversity to financial performance and actually found, you know, this isn't necessarily statistically significant. Correlation is not causation. Kind of issues and holes in in the research that's been done. So I think it's perhaps not as immediately obvious that demographic diversity alone leads to improved performance. But I think that makes sense, right? Because if you have diversity and you don't have inclusion, you don't have equity, you still have systems that reward inequality, then that's going to carry on. That's going to perpetuate itself. So in order for diversity to be linked to performance, you need everything else there as well. You need the inclusive cultures. You need to understand systemic inequalities and historical injustices, and you need to kind of address everything holistically. And I think we need to be honest about it. We shouldn't just refer to studies that we know have been debunked and carry on using that evidence if it's not necessarily true. I think we need to engage with issues that do exist and kind of be honest about, maybe this link isn't as strong as we thought it was, but this is what matters to us and this is why.
Do you think some of it has got to do with quality of data, that we just don't really have enough data about it, that just sort of like raw numbers isn't really reflective? To touch on what you were saying before, just because you have greater diversity doesn't mean that you've had a major cultural shift or anything like that. You may just be turning out patriarchal mini-me's in female form, if you see what I mean.
Oh yeah, I know exactly what you mean. And it's the irony of it, isn't it? And that the way we talk about diversity is kind of a diversity fail in itself, because most of us in this industry, myself included, are numbers people. We believe that what's measured is managed. We want to see everything reduced to data, to charts, to spreadsheets. That's what we're comfortable with. I know I'm totally guilty of that myself. But it means that we're not really understanding or looking at the nuances of the equity and inclusion part of diversity, of DEI, and particularly inclusion. I mean, that's really hard to measure. You're talking about culture and how people feel. And I think that can feel very uncomfortable for a lot of us who are used to just, reducing everything to numbers. So I think, it is a huge issue. And for me, I personally have to try really hard to see outside the numbers and, think about nuance a bit more than I probably naturally do.
Well, that's music to my ears as somebody who works in communications, because I feel that I can definitely echo that I feel that, because sort of the structure of the industry and the way that we're very reliant on sort of star performers, and if we took a sort of very classic asset manager model of a portfolio manager who beats the odds and produces alpha all of the time, you tend to have these situations where it becomes sort of cults around personality, and then everybody else becomes just a sort of secondary support function, and that can be really not a toxic workplace environment. And it gets away from the fact that at the end of the day, there's this professional services, as you said at the beginning of this podcast. We're all about people, and we're people interacting with people. And sometimes I think in the industry, we forget that. We forget how important communications and emotional connection is.
No, I totally agree. And I actually really think we need to bring more people who understand comms and language and behavior and psychology into everything we do with investment. Like for me, I'm comfortable with the numbers. I'm comfortable with, the investment terminology. What I don't know, what my skill set isn't, is really getting that across to the people that we work with and making sure that people engage. In pensions world, that's so important because we're dealing with pensions members. So I would love to see more collaboration between investment experts and comms experts.
Yeah, I think it's a really fascinating discussion. We're slightly moving away from the fundamental tenet. I'm a bit overexcited there, but fundamental tenet of this podcast is to talk about investment. So if we can turn the focus back on that, why is DEI an important consideration for investors, both in terms of, there's two ways we need to look at this, both in terms of how you organize your own organization and then how you select those companies that you're investing in. So if we could address both of those issues, why is DEI important there?
Yeah, I mean, I think it starts off by just looking at your opportunity set. If you're an investor, you want to make sure that the universe of products, of companies, of everything that you're choosing to invest in is as wide as possible so you can choose the best stuff. And I think that's the same when it comes to talent. You don't want to be excluding huge groups of people and then possibly missing out on talent because of that. So just having that wider opportunity set is important. And I mean, diversification, that's something that's absolutely huge in the investment industry too. We think about how we can get differences in our portfolio so that not everything's acting in the same way to reduce risk. I think we can say the same thing about behavior and the way we think, and having people who think in different ways and come up with different ideas is important. And even just for investment opportunities, I mean, we've seen examples with, for example, Black hair care products. There's a huge industry there that if you weren't sort of connecting with Black founders, you might have missed out on a massive opportunity set there as well, because consumers are diverse too. So you need to be appealing to a range of different people in order to have a successful company. So I think that's just the kind of simple financial, you want to make sure that you're making the most of all the opportunities that are out there. I do think on a systemic level, though, we need to think about inequality and injustice as well, and how that, is not necessarily beneficial in the long term to the stability of the economy. So I think, when we take that wider focus, there are good reasons to focus on DEI as well. And I mean, on a personal level, we want to enjoy ourselves working in this industry. We want people to be happy. We want people to stay. We don't want to be losing talent because they're sick of toxic male culture, or, having to pretend that they're from a different background to what they are, or having to hide aspects of themselves. So I think there's an aspect of just getting the most out of people, whether that's within the companies that you invest in or within the asset managers you invest with, just by kind of having inclusive cultures where people from all backgrounds are able to thrive.
Yeah. I mean, to play the sort of the uber rational card for a moment, there is a great, as we've said before, financial services always feel comfortable when they feel like they're being rational. Of course, we never really are truly rational because we're human beings and not automatons. But can we, if we take DEI logically, and you were talking about, making sure you appeal to diversity, and within an asset manager, that's about diversity of thought, right? Because the most pernicious thing for investment is groupthink, right? And that's why I always say that stock markets are fascinating, because they're the longest run continuous psychological mass experiment we've ever done, right? It's herd behavior. And if you want to be successful, you want to know when to ride the herd behavior and when to get off. So we need diversity of thought within asset managers and within investors to be able to do that. How do we embed that? Because if we think about diversity, it's not just about skin color or sexual orientation. If everybody's going to the same university and studying the same subjects, you're going to have very similar ways of thinking. So how do we diversify out of that groupthink? Yeah,
I mean, lots to unpack there. I think what you were saying about rational investors is so fascinating, because markets are just human behavior, which we know isn't rational. So it's so funny how we always kind of act as though markets are this totally rational, independent thing. But anyway, that's maybe a conversation for another episode. But yeah, I do think that cognitive diversity is really important. I think sometimes it can be a bit of a scapegoat to not think about other forms of injustice like sexism and racism. So we shouldn't forget about that. But as you say, you can look quite different, but all think very similarly if you've all had the exact same upbringing. And I think that to really foster an environment where people with different views can be heard, you need the culture. You need a really open, safe culture where people are encouraged to share their views no matter what their level, where there's no kind of shame or ego that gets in the way. And unfortunately, I do think that ego is often associated with masculinity more than femininity. I think by doing that, you're addressing the problem rather than the symptom. Whereas if you just focus on representation, like, how many women do you have on a board? Well, you're only looking at the symptom. You're not looking at the problem of how we got there, how we got to this position where we have such few women at board level. So I think when you really go to address culture, that's how you tackle these issues. But that's hard, and lots of us don't have the skills to do that, because what we're used to doing is spreadsheets and numbers and modeling and making investment decisions. Fostering cultures where people feel safe and where we encourage empathy, that's scary for a lot of us, and we need to be bringing in the right people who can help us with it.
Yeah, I mean, that is scary because what that you're talking about is change, right? And human beings tend to resist change at all costs, right? They always want to try to avoid that. So that's a really tricky thing to come in and do. You've got to be able to change the culture, which requires you not only just to communicate well, but to have a really profound psychological skill set so that you can get people to be interested in change without sparking them to be defensive, and at the same time you yourself not get defensive with if people react badly to you. And I mean, that to me, I think that's one of the most difficult things to do as a human being in any aspect of your life. It's like up there with top level negotiator skills. There are very few people have it, and we don't really have any way or format or ability to even teach that within our industry, or any company, I don't think, really teaches that level of psychological skill. So there's an awful lot that's going to have to change, isn't there?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think starting from a place of empathy and humility helps, because when you have these conversations and when you decide to open yourself up to change, you are going to get things wrong. And I think people getting more comfortable with that, with getting comfortable with saying the wrong thing and learning from it, and perhaps realizing that they've had biases that they need to unlearn. It means kind of looking into yourself and fundamentally realizing that you're not perfect and you get things wrong, and that's hard as well. So I think that's why it's difficult for so many of us. But I do think that now more than ever, it's really, really important, because we are living in a time where lots of people from different marginalized communities feel really unsafe. There are hate crimes on the rise everywhere. I personally felt it during the far right riots in the UK last summer. Anti-Semitism, transphobia, Islamophobia, homophobia, hate crimes against all groups are on the rise. So we really, really need to stand up now and support our colleagues in our industry and our clients and, everyone we work with, to show that, we're not going to tolerate hate.
So what do you think the best approach is for investors to approach this? First, from the perspective, let's talk about a changing environment, right? We've got this big anti-DEI backlash, and that can be very difficult for, let's just take asset managers, for example. A global asset manager is now having to sort of like have different policies for different regions, basically, which sort of undermines the whole perspective of being global. Is there a way through that, do you think?
I think it's really tough to navigate, but I think keeping the long-term perspective is really important. Remembering that a lot of our clients, a lot of the decisions we're making, they're much longer than these election cycles or kind of short-term blips in hate. So we need to really remember what we stand for, what our values are, what our fundamental investment beliefs are, go back to basics on that. And I think if you start from there, then you don't get as swayed by what's going on in the world. And we know that this is an industry that can have a huge amount of influence if it wants to. So let's use that positively.
Mm-hmm. But, maybe those companies have no choice but to develop different policies or stay quiet almost. We've heard about green hushing. Maybe there's a bit of DEI hushing that's going to go on, but people are sort of going to carry on as before because they believe in it, but just not talk about it.
Yeah, but I don't think that's possible, because that's going to make people feel unsafe. I think you have to be vocal about these sort of things. Otherwise,
well, the problem is if you do one thing and say another, you look hypocritical too.
Well, yeah.
As politicians have discovered, if you say one thing and do another, then you just end up, nobody likes you. You try to keep one group happy, but everybody just decides that you're a liar, basically.
Yeah, that's so true. Yeah.
So I don't think there are. So what you're saying is there aren't any easy decisions. Are there people who are going to kind of win out in this situation? Is it the people who feel like that they can stick to their principles and be vocal about it? Even if that means those people are maybe prepared to walk away from some business if it comes down to that?
I think in the long term, that's what I would hope to see. I think in the short term, we may see some less pleasant figures winning from this. But, my hope is, and I think I personally, for my own sanity, have to believe that kind of white supremacy and misogyny isn't going to triumph, and that the longer term perspective of those of us who want a better world is what's going to last, and that's going to be the rational way to approach things.
So if that's the challenge from, an asset manager trying to manage the kind of competing demands in different global regions, what's the challenge? What's the steps they should be taking when they're actually investing? What should they be looking at? As we discussed at the beginning, we talked about maybe some of the data isn't as reliable. Is it again about deciding what your investment principles are and just sticking to it, being consistent?
Yeah, I think it is. And in a way, it's like not being spineless. Like, you have your convictions, stick to them. You know what you believe in. You don't have to flip flop everywhere because of different sentiment coming from elsewhere. If somebody was telling you, oh, I don't agree with hedging, but you knew that it was the right thing in the long term, you would still do that. So I think, I think we need to treat other issues like ESG or DEI in a similar way.
And I mean, underneath the scenes, beyond the noise, things are maybe becoming more sophisticated, certainly within the ESG field and sustainable investing. How people approaching it is sort of, there's a lot of talk about anti-ESG, but within the UK institutional space, the kind of things are ratcheting on, regulation is continuing, people are becoming more sophisticated in their approaches. Do you think that's going to happen too with DI and with the sort of the S factor, if you see what I mean, the social factor? I mean, we've seen that slightly ignored at the behest of big focus on environmental. How do you see that evolving, even in this kind of difficult environment?
Yeah, I think it is evolving. I think similar to the conversations we were having before about numbers, social stuff is harder to measure. So that's one of the reasons we've neglected it a bit. But, we had the DWP's task force on social factors. I think that was last year or maybe the year before. So we do know that the government cares about this. And we do have groups that are working with this. I mean, we have a kind of people focused theme within Pensions for Purpose where we're thinking about this subject. Lots of the members that we speak to still care. So I don't think it's going anywhere. And I'm certainly not going to let it go anywhere as sort of disappear as far as I'm able to.
And have you got sort of new research projects coming up about that? Is there new areas that you're looking into? Can you talk to us a bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we're building, so at Pensions for Purpose, we've got a set of ecosystem themes where we're sort of focusing on different themes over the next 3 years. And one of those themes is people. So for that theme, we will be, that covers DEI, but it also covers other stuff as well relating to that kind of people factor. We are convening community interest groups of asset owners and asset allocators who are keen to do more in this area. We'll be conducting research, we'll be running various events. So I'm sure I can add a link or something or send more information over about that. But I think it'll be a good way to keep the conversation going.
And we talked a lot about asset managers, but how are you feeling that asset owners, the pension schemes and insurance companies, how is their thinking on this evolving? Are they buffeted by the winds of news, so to speak, or are they just sort of like carrying on in their own style? Has it detached some people from maybe carrying on this journey, or?
I think asset owners are being stronger than ever on this, to be honest. And I think asset owners, I mean, I should caveat that most of the asset owners I work with are UK and Europe based, so it might be different if you were out in the US. But most of the asset owners I speak to actually feel like they need to use their voice more than ever now because there is pushback coming across the pond and because some of those asset managers that also have big US client bases are struggling. So we saw, I mean, in relation to climate, the asset owner climate stewardship statement that came out where a bunch of big UK asset owners signed a statement saying, we still take climate change very seriously and it will feed into how we select managers. And I think that gave a really, really strong signal in the backdrop of what's going on across the pond that, asset owners are going to carry on as they were and they're going to use their voice. So DEI, I hope, is going to be part of that as well. And I certainly haven't seen any rollback from asset owners on their approach.
Yeah, which does make life tough for those asset managers that we mentioned before, the global ones who are having to manage different messages to different regions or even try and figure out if they're going to say anything at all because...
And even within a region, even in the US, there are some people who are really anti-ESG and DEI. There are still plenty of people, if you look at CalPERS or some of those sort of big asset owners, long-term universal owners, they're still taking a lot of this very seriously. So I think it's hard, but I think this is the time to find a bit of a moral compass and remember your values and your beliefs and sort of go back to that.
Yeah, and always remember that when we're in financial services, if you can put a rational spin on things, that will be very appealing too, right?
Yeah, always.
So we do love to think of ourselves as rationalists, don't we? There's great comfort in that. So what would you hope to have next sort of few years? How would you hope that this conversation evolves despite the headwinds?
Yeah, I mean, I hope we keep talking about it, but we're not just talking about it, we're taking action as well. I hope that we are really supporting our colleagues. I think that's probably the most important to me right now, is just making sure we support our colleagues and clients from marginalized backgrounds who feel unsafe. I think that's really, really important. And I hope sort of longer term, we're also looking to address wider inequalities and sort of hateful messages that go out, thinking about the lobbying we're doing and who we're supporting. Because things are going to get more challenging over the coming years. We're seeing the physical impacts of climate change come through. We're seeing biodiversity loss. We're seeing all sorts of issues, conflict, war. All of that does lead to, political messaging in the form of hate, anti-immigrant sentiment, all of that kind of thing. So it's going to be tough. So we really, really, really need to stand up more than ever now and support each other.
Yeah, and I think as well that, to go back to our conversation about cultural change, which is really at the heart of what you need in order to foster an environment for diverse thinking. We need to see the industry embrace the fact that it may have to do something fairly radical on that way, and actually kind of maybe take their fingertips off the ledge of rationality and admit that they are humans, and maybe learning how to communicate and learn the psychology of change might be helpful too.
Absolutely. It's gonna be scary, but it's gonna be worth it, I think.
Well, I think that is a great place for us to end the podcast today. Thank you so much, Laasya, for being our guest and trotting us through such an interesting and diverse conversation. It's been truly fascinating. Thanks for being on the show, Laasya.
Thank you so much for having me.
And listeners, if you want to make sure that you never miss an episode, do hit the subscribe button and do engage with us as much as possible. Do comment on the podcast. There's a poll on the Spotify version of the podcast. And we just want to thank you for listening.